years as a special education teacher, working primarily with students with emotional and behavior disabilities. Then left the classroom and spent about 5 years teaching special education at the collegiate level and missed the classroom so much. I went back in the classroom. And then finally, I'm here at the Office of Special Education Services. And I am a member of the social emotional learning team. So as you can guess, a topic such as exclusionary discipline is very near and dear to my heart. So, and that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about exclusionary discipline, and we are really going to focus on the impact that it has had on education. And our slogan for today, and the one thing that I want you to keep in mind and take away if you don't remember anything else I say today, is just our slogan and just that embedded philosophy of keep them so that you can teach them. If kids aren't in the classroom, they aren't able to learn, they aren't able to get the necessary academic and behavior skills they need to be successful in a classroom and beyond. So here's our agenda for today. First, we're just going to take a quick look at the definition of exclusionary discipline. I know you all are familiar with it, but we'll talk a little bit about specifically what exclusionary discipline practices are. We'll talk about what it looks like. And in the world we live in, we don't know if we're going to be virtual this week or face-to-face one week to the next. So I will talk about what exclusionary discipline practices look like in both the face-to-face environment as well as the virtual environment. And then I'll talk a little bit about why exclusionary discipline practices occur. Some of those contributing factors to exclusionary discipline. When we think about some of the adverse effects that exclusionary discipline has had. Then we'll talk about why does it matter? Why do we as educators, why should we be concerned with exclusionary discipline? And why do we need to take action in making sure that we're preventing it? Last, we'll finish up talking about addressing the behavior. And when I talk about addressing the behavior, you'll see that I'm not really just talking about addressing the student's behavior, but I am also talking about taking a look in the mirror and addressing some of those behaviors that we have as educators that actually contribute to some of the behaviors in the classroom or actually contribute to some of the issues that lead to exclusionary discipline. Again, we'll finish up with some alternatives, hopefully, to exclusionary discipline practices. So take a minute and just take this ride with me. So what is exclusionary discipline? Well, we know that exclusionary discipline is a variety of different discipline practices whose intended use is to reduce undesirable behaviors. It involves the removal of a student from having access to his or her usual education setting. And it's important that we mention that is their usual education setting. That may look just a little bit different in the virtual environment because it may not, you can't necessarily physically remove that student, but it is going to result in a denial of access to. So in the virtual environment, it's going to be that denial of access to or removal from their usual education environment. Now, when we talk about exclusionary discipline, we know it isn't anything new and it isn't a new term, but what is new is we're just starting to get, I guess you can say, the side effects or the ramifications of exclusionary discipline practices. Student discipline and its relationship to school climate and classroom instructional capacity has always been a central concern to educators. But recently, under the Obama administration, the U.S. Department of Education began to basically collect and disseminate national data related to school discipline practices and outcomes. And basically what this did is it really instituted a heightened awareness regarding the disparities that exclusionary discipline practices lead to. And that's why it's such an important topic for us here today. So what does exclusionary discipline look like in that face-to-face environment? Well, of course, you know that the two most common forms of exclusionary discipline practices used to attempt to reduce problem behavior are suspension and expulsion. There's two types of suspension that you are aware of. There's that out-of-school suspension, and out-of-school suspension includes instances in which the child is temporarily removed from his or her regular classroom or learning environment for disciplinary purposes. This includes the removal of students with disabilities, even if those services follow them. So if a student with disability is removed from a classroom for several days and they still get tutoring or special education services or homebound or anything like that, that still constitutes an out-of-school suspension. Then we have those in-school suspensions, which involves the temporary removal of a student from a normal learning environment, but they don't necessarily have to come out of the school environment. So they usually remain within that school environment, but it's usually under the direct supervision of school personnel. Then we get down to expulsions. And of course, expulsions are a little more permanent. They involve the long-term removal of a student, generally for the remainder of the school year, from their normal learning environment. This can be with or without educational services provided. And of course, as we'll see as we talk a little bit later, expulsions are often a result of those zero tolerance policies. So what does exclusion look like in the virtual environment? Well, it looks the same. We're still taking that student and we're still removing them from their normal learning environment, but it just may look a little different. So in the virtual environment, it may look like locking that student out of class, locking them out of discussions or other online forums. It may be limiting or reducing or restricting their audio or video. It could be having that student to go to a supervised alternative room that's not their regular educational environment, and that's for purposes other than getting additional work or tutoring or anything like that. It can also be blocking the students' access to email or the district's online programs. And I really thought it was important to really show what exclusion in the virtual environment looks like in the virtual environment as well as the face-to-face environment, because oftentimes we utilize some of these exclusionary practices without even realizing that we're doing so. I think another thing to note is that when we are using these practices have to be documented. If a child is suspended or expelled in any way or excluded, then those practices have to be documented. So now that we've talked a little bit about what exclusionary practices are and what exclusionary discipline looks like, I'm going to give you just a few common scenarios that we see every day. And you're just going to type in the chat whether or not you believe that's an exclusionary practice. So first scenario, you, the teacher or the administrator, tell little Johnny's mother to come pick him up from school early so that he can cool down. Is this an exclusionary practice? And I see the poll is up. You tell little Johnny's mother to come pick him up from school early so that he can cool down. And it says cannot vote. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading it, that's talking to me.
So Shannon, it looks like we've got most of our participants, about 71% now have voted. And we've got one individual that would like a little bit more information.
Well, and the reason why I use this scenario, and again, like I said, most of my background experience is at the high school level. So, and I've even seen this at the primary levels, a common practice of the administrator, little Johnny having an incident in school, it escalating, and the administrator calling Johnny's mom saying, you know, come pick Johnny up and take him home so he can calm down. It's just whether or not you think it's an exclusionary practice. Do you think it can lead to exclusionary practices? What do you think? And Taylor, what are most of the votes voting towards?
So right now it looks like the greater portion, 92% of our participants today say, yes, this is in fact an exclusionary discipline practice. So I'm going to go ahead and end the polling and let you staff that one.
Exactly. It is definitely an exclusionary practice, especially if it's something that's done continuously over time. If you think, if little Johnny has an incident 1 or 2 times a week over the course of the school year, that's 2 times that the administrator may be calling, having little Johnny go home for half a day. This may be informal, it may be undocumented, but just think about the immense amount of instructional time that little Johnny's missing because he's going home early every day. Also, think about not just the academics that he's missing, but the time that the teacher has to teach those needed social and behavioral skills that he's also missing out on. Next one, very similar. You ask mom to keep Sam home for a few days. You ask mom to keep Sam home for a few days until he's ready to come back. And what do we have most leaning towards, Taylor? I'll go through the rest of them.
It looks like right now we've got most leaning towards yes, about 89% of our participants saying yes, this is exclusionary. And we have a few folks here that would like to hear a few more details.
You ask mom to keep Sam home for a few days until he's ready to come back. Again, it becomes the same thing like the first incidents. It becomes a habit. It becomes reinforcement, not just for the teacher who gets rid of little Sam because she gets that time off, but think about little Sam. If that behavior, if what he wants from that behavior is escape, now you're reinforcing that behavior because now little Sam gets to go home every day. And now he knows I can act up or whatever this major incident is, and I'm going to get to go home for a few days. Again, it comes back to the amount of instructional time that he's missing. It also comes back to the fact that this can't be a regular intervention that administrators or teachers use to take care of the student. They have to deal with the problem behavior. What's leading to these escalations that's causing Sam to go home? And I'll go through the next few just for the sake of time. You lock a student out of their virtual class for disruption. You tell them they can return in a few days. Again, in most of these, I tried to put some type of, I know these are very vague examples, scenarios, but I tried to put that time period in so that you can see if it's consistent or if it's something that's happened over several days or over a long time period. It becomes an exclusionary practice when you take in consideration the instructional time that that student is missing. The administrator, and I've seen this a lot, especially at the high school level, the administrator tells the student to go to study hall for a few days instead of going to math. Student could have had it falling out with the math teacher, and the administrator just feels like the easy way out. You just go spend a little bit of time in study hall. Well, those few days that he spent in study hall, that student has missed math. So that, again, becomes an exclusionary practice. You have to deal with the root cause of the behavior. And the last one, Sarah needs 15 minutes to cool down in the hallway. Is that an exclusionary practice? And that's a trick one. I just kind of put that in there. Go ahead, you can tell me what it says. I see it popped up. I wasn't sure if you're going to put it up or not.
Sorry, there was a bit of lag on that one. Folks jumped on really quickly.
Oh, you're fine.
Oh, this one's split. This is a tough one. So we've got, it's about 57% saying no, 31% saying yes.
And again, it goes back to how often it is used. Oftentimes we use cool down as an intervention. And if Sarah really is going into the hallway because she needs that intervention, because we're removing her from the situation and it's being used wisely, that 15 minutes is a good use of time. But again, if it's something that's being used over time, or if the teacher is sending her out into the hallway for those 15 minutes, she's not asking for that cool down time. The teacher is actually sending that student out for the cool down time. And we teachers know sometimes we need that cool down time. So it really is how you use the practice, but you have to be aware of some of the different things that we'll talk about when you are resulting to using some of these practices. And let's move on. So what are some of those factors that contribute to exclusionary discipline? Well, one of the biggest things is implicit biases. And the implicit bias are the attitudes, the stereotypes, and the beliefs that we as teachers bring to the table. And these attitudes, these stereotypes, they really influence our understanding. They influence our actions. They influence our decisions in an unconscious manner. These biases are activated involuntarily and usually without an individual's awareness or intention and control. And you can understand how, as a teacher, this can really have an influence on the actions and the decisions you make in terms of certain behaviors. These sorry, I can't talk today. These biases are different from known biases that individuals may choose to conceal for the purposes of social or political correctnesses, because these biases are activated subconsciously. Relying on them requires very little mental effort on our part. So the issue is, or the problem is, when a teacher comes in contact with a student whose background or whose culture that they may not be familiar with, then they rely on these stereotypes and they rely on these biases and these beliefs, rather than consciously assessing information, constantly assessing the situation and making those conscious decisions. I think that it's important that educational professionals have to be aware of and consider the ways in which their unconscious biases affect their discipline decisions in their districts, at the school level, at the administrative level, and they have to incur a deeper understanding of the influence of these implicit biases. I think another issue that contributes to exclusionary discipline practices are the cultural mismatch between teachers and students. I don't think it's a secret that there's a disproportionate number of white teachers to students of color, and just a diverse array of students that come into the classroom. And whether or not we want to admit it, representation matters. So that cultural mismatch, whether it be Black teachers or white teachers or whatever that cultural mismatch is, it definitely contributes. Again, it goes back to some of those implicit biases. Another thing that has really contributed to exclusionary discipline are the standards-based accountability movement. And basically, this is just those increased pressures that schools have to show academic progress. Basically, they have created these incentives for teachers and administrators to suspend those students, to get rid of those students who are deemed problematic, those students who are deemed disruptive to the learning environment. And it just so happens that these also happen to be the same students that have the lower test scores. So we can see the connection there in terms of how that standards-based accountability movement has contributed to some of those exclusionary discipline practices. And finally, I think one of the biggest is are those zero tolerance policies. And if we really think about the root of zero tolerance policies, when they first came out, you know, they were good intentions. Zero tolerance policies came out as a way to make schools safer. But there seems to have been a dramatic shift in education from rehabilitation in education towards, I think, criminalization. And we can see that this is evident just if we look at the number of criminal personnel that we have in our schools. All schools now have SRO officers. Many of the referrals and many of the incidences that go on in schools are now dealt with by officers and different things like that. So there's definitely kind of been that shift towards criminalization. This started beginning in the late 90s, where we started to see those zero tolerance policies. And they kind of modeled those Reagan era laws. These zero tolerance policies mandated severe consequences, including suspension and expulsion for a range of misbehaviors. And it basically rested on the assumption that if we remove some students from schools, those problematic students, then it would basically deter other students from engaging in similar behaviors. But as we can see, and we'll talk about in some of the research, this truly has not been the case. More than 2 decades later, research tells us that these measures have not succeeded in making schools safer. But what they have done is greatly contribute to the increased likelihood of adverse effects, such as students dropping out of high school and ending up in the criminal justice system. So why does it matter? What are the issues with exclusionary discipline practice, and why does it matter, and why should we as educators be alarmed? Well, the biggest thing is because of the societal impact that it has. When we look at the societal impact, we can't talk about exclusionary discipline practices without talking about that school to prison pipeline. And tailored into that, and you'll see when I talk about some of the research with suspension and expulsions at the preschool level, that is not just the school to prison, the prison pipeline anymore. We're talking about a preschool to prison pipeline, because some of these practices and some of this, these discrepancies start far beyond the time the students get into middle school and high school. So when we refer to the school to prison pipeline, we're basically talking about the policies and practices that are directly and indirectly pushing students out of school, primarily students of color and individuals with disabilities, pushing them out of schools onto that pathway to prison. Many different practices, such as harsh school discipline policies, overuse of suspension, expulsion. We see increased policing, we see surveillance. We see many schools that have very prison-like atmospheres now. And basically this over-reliance on referrals in the criminal justice system is really just leading students towards that juvenile justice system. The research shows us that students who experience even just one suspension are twice as likely to be involved in the criminal justice system over those who have never received any discipline or any suspensions. Additionally, students who receive harsh punitive discipline, such as suspensions, were 4 times more likely to report being arrested than the individual who had never received any suspension. So we can see where that correlation between suspension and getting that involvement with the criminal justice system. The school to prison pipeline disproportionately places students of color, including students of that LGBTQ community, and ELL learners into a criminal justice system for just very minor infractions. And some of those subjective behaviors, such as insubordination, refusal to obey, some of those different things like that. The school to prison pipeline greatly diminishes their educational opportunities, and it really changes their life trajectories. Another impact really has to do with the inequities associated with school discipline. And as we'll see in the next slide, it really continues to put Black students and other students of color at a disadvantage, and also students with disabilities. Exclusionary discipline only strengthens the current deeply embedded inequities that already exist in the school system. And here are just some quick facts that I actually pulled from that Office of Civil Rights report that is part of that report that the Obama administration actually mandated. And these were just some facts that I just thought were astonishing and kind of pulled from that. Expulsion rates are highest in pre-kindergarten classes. I was flabbergasted by that. I can't understand what kindergartners are doing or preschoolers are doing that they actually are being expelled from school. But recent data indicates that expulsions and suspensions occur with regularity in preschool settings, which is very problematic when we consider the well-established research indicating that these practices do influence a number of adverse outcomes across development, health, and education. Look at the next one. African-American boys are most likely to face exclusionary discipline for non-serious behavior. Again, it goes back to that implicit biasness. Just to give you some of the facts on that, Black students are expelled from school at disproportionately high rates. Black students are 1.9 times as likely to be expelled from school without their educational services following them. While Black males particularly only represent 8% of all students, they represent 19% of the students expelled. Black girls only represent 8% of all students, yet they represent 9% of all students expelled. Black students are more likely to be disciplined through law enforcement. They are 2.2 times as likely to receive a referral to law enforcement or to be subjected to school-related arrests as their white counterparts. Also, expulsion rates are up to 3 times higher for students with low socioeconomic status. Nationally, between 30 to 80% of youth who are detained or incarcerated have a disability. And again, we can see it leads back to students who are expelled are twice as likely to repeat a grade and 3 times as likely to get involved with the juvenile justice system. And this is just a graph that I pulled that looks at preschool suspension and expulsions. And you can see the purplish blue. I'm not sure how it looks on your screen, but this shows the share of the preschool population. So we can see any preschool population student with the disability only makes up about 13% of the population, yet they make up an astounding 75% of the suspensions and expulsions. And if we look at it broken down by particular behaviors, we see that is followed by students with behavior problems and students with ADHD. So these students with ADHD make up about 2% of the population, while students with behavior problems make up about 4% of the population. But look at the share of suspensions and expulsions they make up. That is a lot. And that indicates that there's something that needs to be done at that level. So let's look at the social emotional impact that exclusionary practices have. Well, the biggest thing is that it leads to feelings of disconnectedness from our students. We know that these interventions don't address the root causes of the behavior. They only disrupt the learning environment, but they also lead to students feel undervalued and unwelcome. Suspensions and expulsions have an impact on school climate. Students report that exclusionary disciplinary interventions led them to disconnect from school. Many students who receive OSS, they're left home, they're unsupervised, they don't really have any activities. The teacher didn't send their work with them. So when they return to school, they're behind in their classwork. They may not understand what's going on, and they disconnect. They become very easily disengaged. And we know that this just leads to that continuous cycle. Additionally, another thing is students realize and they see those inconsistencies. they can see the inconsistencies in terms of how they're treated, in terms of how other students are treated. So that also leads them to disconnect and have a mistrust for schools, a mistrust for administrators, and a mistrust for the disciplinary process. So this has a negative effect on students' relationships with schools, adults, and their faith in the school disciplinary process. Over time, students grow more and more resentful towards the system, and it often leads to them only getting in more trouble. Another thing in terms of the social emotional impact is the trauma that exclusive practices induce on our students. Let's face it, our students come to us with burdens to bear. We have to consider the trauma or the traumatic impact that exclusionary discipline can have on our students. It can truly be a traumatic process, going through the hearing process, sitting at the hearing board. It can be traumatic for the students. It can be traumatic for their families. Our students come to us with burdens to bear. They are dealing with so much. They have to endure so much. They carry so much. I mean, we have no idea, the burdens that many of our students bring to us. And then, they come into school in their place of safety, their environment of safety, and then they're mistreated and they're put out often for very, very minimum behaviors. Excessive discipline only contributes to those burdens, adding even more pressures and strains to a child's already chaotic life, especially when we consider a time like this. The trauma exclusionary discipline can induce is of serious concern, and I think it's something that we have to take into consideration. Now let's look at the academic impact that exclusionary discipline can have. Well, we already know that it causes students a significant loss of instructional time, and it's also counterproductive by removing a student from the learning environment when they already have academic gaps that exist. Exclusionary discipline is a moderate to strong predictor of school dropout, and it also increases the chances of students being retained, which of course, if students are retained, then we know that they are more likely to drop out. Removing a student from the school for whatever reason is counterintuitive, since it punishes them by removing them from their learning environment. If we look at recent research, it found that 43% of serious disciplinary actions nationwide were for very minor incidences, such as insubordination. So let's look at the graph. And you can see this is a graph that depicts high school and post-secondary outcomes based on 9th grade suspensions. And if you take a look at this, going up shows the increased number of suspensions. And if you just look at the blue lines in terms of the amount of students dropped out, you can almost draw a diagonal line. This shows a very strong positive correlation between the number of suspensions, and the likelihood that a student will drop out. You can also do the same thing the opposite way. If we're looking at the red for the number of students that graduate and we're looking at the amount of suspensions, you can see that graduation significantly reduces each time the chances of graduation are significantly reduced each time a child is suspended. I just want to make sure I hit all the notes on that. In grades K through 12, students are disproportionately suspended from school. Students with disabilities served by IDEA make up about 12% of those suspension rates and are more than twice as likely to receive one or more out-of-school suspensions as students without disabilities. So again, if we're talking about students with disabilities receiving one or more out-of-school suspensions, and then we're looking at this map in correlation saying that the more suspensions decrease their chance of graduating, look at the amount of students with disabilities who already, have limited chances of graduating. Now we're adding more to that by suspending them. So we have to take all of this into consideration in terms of the academic impact that exclusionary discipline practices have. So what do we do? How can we fix it? What do we do as educators? Well, we can do a lot. There are some very specific cultural and environmental changes that we can do. One of the most important things that we can do, although there's no single formula to reverse the harmful effects that exclusionary discipline practices have had, a good first step is definitely ensuring effective policies are in place to prevent expulsions and suspension. We have to look at and we have to revise those zero tolerance policies, and we have to make sure that we're only using those zero tolerance policies in the most extreme cases when they're really needed. We have to also look at our policies and ensure non-discriminatory policies and practices are in the book. We have to eliminate or minimize exclusionary discipline practices for certain age levels. Many states have already gone to this, and they are eliminating suspensions and expulsions for like up to second grade. So really looking at, is it necessary for certain grade levels to even have, is suspension and expulsions, should that even be a opportunity for those kids? Also, eliminating exclusionary discipline practices for certain types of non-violent infractions. So again, some of those zero tolerance policies that came out and said if this happens, then automatic expulsion. But we have to take a look back at those policies and make sure that non-violent infractions that don't cause for expulsion, we're not expelling kids for insubordination or for not paying attention or different things like that, especially when we consider some of the implicit biasness and the impact that our own behavior has. The next thing, relationships matter. Just this for me just goes back to the whole thing of kids don't care what you know until they know you care. Again, most of my experience is at the secondary level. I've always worked with high school kids. I know the importance of strong relationships. I could say things to my kids, fuss at my kids, and tell them things that the next teacher couldn't, just because I took that time in the beginning to build those strong relationships. Strong student-teacher relationships matter, but not only that, strong teacher-parent relationships matter. Interventions that focus on strengthening teacher-student relationships can significantly reduce the use of exclusionary practices. The most effective teachers in working with challenging behaviors had very positive relationships with their students. The effectiveness of responses depend on whether or not the school culture facilitates those relationships between the students and educators, allows for open communication, and provides ample opportunities for that school-family collaboration. And again, I just can't stress enough the idea that relationships do truly matter. The next thing that we can do is focus on academics. We have to look at, given all the information and what the research has told us in terms of early childhood education, we have to ensure that we have those early childhood education programs. Sorry, this got a little off. So again, high quality early childhood programs provide the positive experience that nurture positive learning and development. Suspensions and expulsions can influence a number of adverse outcomes across development, health, and education. Young students who are expelled or suspended are as much as 10 times more likely to drop out of school, experience academic failure and grade retention, hold negative school attitudes, and face incarceration than those who not. So we know that it starts at the early childhood level, and we have to ensure that there are high quality early childhood programs. I think the other thing in terms of early childhood programs is we have to ensure that early childhood workforce is adequately trained, supported, and prepared to help children excel, as well as deal with the variety of different behavior problems that students come with. The next thing is we have to have high quality instruction. We have to have culturally inclusive and culturally relevant instruction, and we have to have the appropriate academic support. So when we talk about the whole MTSS, RTI, we know that most behavior problems stem from academic problems. So we have to make sure that the correct academic supports and tutoring are there. In terms of reading, researchers have found that academic achievement is linked to a range of social skills, including levels of aggression and classroom behavior. A recent longitudinal study revealed the interaction of behavior and academic achievement in children found that children struggling to read in the first and third grades were very likely to exhibit teacher-reported aggression by the third grade, which was then associated with low academic achievement in the fifth grade. This research really indicates that as expectations of reading mastery increase through the early and elementary grades, students who struggled with reading tasks begin to exhibit acting out behaviors. And this acting out negatively affected classroom interactions between the teacher and student and was associated with poor academic achievement in the later grades. So this really indicates to us that interventions need to specifically target the early childhood and elementary grades and focus on additional, and we have to focus additional resources on struggling readers. And one of the other things we can do, and for me, this is one of the important things for me, I think it is to question our own behavior. And again, when I told you earlier, when I was going to talk about behavior and questioning our own behavior, is our own behavior as educators in relation to how do we contribute to students' behavior? How do we escalate or de-escalate children's behavior? So I think it's important for educators to have a deeper awareness about their actions and the impact that it has on students. Students may be subjected to individual school personnel biases about what constitutes disruption. So we as educators have to have an awareness of and respect for the culture differences that exist. We have to acknowledge the fact that we have a variety of different cultures in our classrooms, different students with different backgrounds. So we just have to be aware of that, and we have to have a willingness and a flexibility to accept the culture differences that exist. I think there also has to be, again, it comes back to that educator awareness regarding our own actions. We have to truly be aware of the impact that we have on students' behavior, as well as the decision that we're going to make regarding that students' behavior, whether to write them up, whether to expel them, those different things. We have to understand how that action is going to impact that student in the short term and the long term. We also have to understand how behavior change works. And I'll tell you a little bit about what I'm talking about. What's your function? We have to understand the function of the behavior. What is the behavior trying to tell you? And some of the older ones out there may remember the conjunction, junction, what's your function, dude? So again, when I talk about questioning our own behavior, I have to talk about this through the lens of the competing behavior model. And I can't really talk about behavior and talk about alternatives behavior without talking about the functioning of behavior. But when I talk about questioning our own behavior, I have to, let me explain. This is what's going on right now. There's some type of problem behavior that's going on. There's an antecedent or predictor that leads to the behavior. I tell little Johnny to do his work. Little Johnny refuses. Then there's something that maintains that behavior. Either he escapes or avoids something. This is what's happening right now. This is what we as educators would like to happen. I would like to tell little Johnny to do his work. Little Johnny does his work. He responds within a reasonable amount of time, and I continue to maintain that behavior by whatever that consequence is. But I think that what we as educators, again, going back to question our own behavior, is we have to be flexible and we have to be willing to meet somewhere in the middle. So this shows a competing behavior model in terms of this is what we'd be happy with in the meantime. I think that one of the things that we as educators don't really understand, or well, we understand, but we want it to happen overnight. We have to realize that Rome was not built overnight. So I cannot change a student's behavior that he's been doing just about his entire life within 36 weeks. And I know we do it all the time. We're ambitious. Again, I've been that ED teacher. I written those IEPs. By end of 36 weeks, little Johnny will, no longer use whatever cuss words, or we use more appropriate words, or whatever, by the end of 36 weeks. And again, like I said, I'm secondary, so my worst daily behavior was cursing or something so simple as that. But again, it comes back to what will I be happy with in the meantime? Of course, I want my students to use appropriate behavior all the time. I want them to be able to have positive words to communicate. But I had students, that would curse and, oh, excuse me, Dr. Jones, my bad, Dr. Jones, and self-correct. So as an educator, I have to decide, is this something that I can deal with in the meantime? Until they get to that desirable behavior, can I handle the fact that that student is able to acknowledge and self-correct that behavior or cursing or whatever, and is that something I can deal with? And I think that this is a problem that we as educators have, because we're not willing to be flexible in terms of the behavior that we can deal with in the meantime. Now, little Johnny has been cussing since second grade. I can't expect that within my 36 weeks that I have little Johnny, I'm going to completely be able to extinguish that behavior. But I can find a more appropriate behavior that's realistic for little Johnny to do. That's also a behavior that I can deal with in the meantime. So when I talk about questioning our own behavior, I really am talking about us as educators understanding how we can de-escalate a behavior, escalate a behavior, how we really have that control at the classroom level before it leads to exclusionary practices. As a teacher, I can write little Johnny up every time he cusses, and after several write-ups, he's suspended from school, or I can deal with those behaviors that I can deal with at that time until we get little Johnny to where he needs to be. So, all right, so let's move on. Proactive approaches. What can be done to reduce behavior issues before they start? The biggest one is teacher preparation. All educators must be provided with extensive and ongoing training and professional development in these areas, but not limited to just these areas. Teachers have to have an understanding of and be able to manage their own classrooms. So behavior management, discipline, really conflict resolution, social emotional learning, and also diversity, I think is really important. Teachers must also be trained to recognize behaviors that may be a manifestation of students' disability. I think that's also part of that teacher training as well. This training is essential to ensure that children with disabilities receive reasonable modifications for their disabilities and are not impermissibly suspended or expelled for behaviors caused by their disabilities. So as a part of that teacher preparation, we got to teach teachers to deal with students with disabilities, not just those special ed teachers. Also, training should also focus on cultural competence, which has to do with the capacity to interact effectively and respectively with people from different cultures, different racial cultures, different economic backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds. Such competence includes understanding that different cultures have different codes of communication, different styles of behavior. And it also means being open to learn from others and to shift our own cultural paradigm. And I think that's very important as teachers, so that we can refrain from judging people before we even get to know them. Another proactive approach, I'm sure all of you all are familiar with positive behavior interventions and supports. So I won't get in too deeply with this, but I will just mention it. Positive behavior interventions and supports, also known as PBIS. It is universal school-wide prevention strategy that seeks to improve the behavior, but it also seeks to improve the school climate. And I think that that is very important. Positive behavior interventions and supports aim to improve school culture and climate and improve student behavior so that teachers can teach and so that students can learn. And we're very familiar with this. The only thing I want to mention about this, it uses that three-tiered model to create those secondary, those targeted, and those intervention individual systems of support. I think another part of this is the pyramid model. And the pyramid model is basically the early childhood model, or the early childhood version of PBIS. But it's implemented and taught in such a way that is developmentally appropriate for young children in early childhood and early learning childcare programs. I apologize. It's designed as a program-wide intervention and should be implemented with fidelity. And some of those things that that pyramid model needs to instill or have, it acknowledges and reinforces positive child behavior. It directly teaches social skills, expectations, and behaviors to children related to different environments, monitors children's challenging behaviors, and it teaches those positive replacement behaviors. Mouse keeps getting stuck. Finally, we have to focus on the social emotional learning needs of kids. We have to take care, again, some of our kids, like I mentioned earlier, come to us with burdens to bear. So we have to make sure that we are attending to those burdens. We have to make sure that we are giving them the behavior skills that they need to be able to be effective communicators. Social emotional learning refers to the process of integrating thinking, feeling, and behaving in order to become aware of yourself and others. Research supports the notion that targeted social emotional learning interventions can improve the social emotional attributes of classrooms, and it helps to facilitate students' social emotional and academic well-being. So what we know is that children need to feel connected to others. They need to have confidence in their abilities. They need to feel secure in their environment. School settings have much to do with meeting these needs and fostering these types of positive interventions. When classrooms emulate positivity and encouragement, students are more likely to get their social and emotional needs met in return and also flourish in society. And I just put one example of a social emotional learning curriculum down there. You guys are free to look that up, and there's plenty others out there, but the ruler approach, which stands for recognizing, understanding, labeling, expressing, and regulating emotions. And it really teaches students how to do those things with those emotions through a specified curriculum. So what are those reactive approaches? What can we do? The behavior has already happened. What can we do instead of expelling that kid? Well, again, we have to keep them so that we can teach them. One very prominent practice that has become very popular is restorative justice. It is research-based, and basically it's a process that proactively builds healthy relationships and a sense of community to prevent and address conflict and wrongdoing. It involves 3 phases. It can change the culture of a school and greatly improve school climate. And the thing I like about it is it really helps to return that balance to the immediate parties. The thing about restorative justice is it's a process in which you get the victim or the person that whatever the incident was done to, and they pair up with the person that did it, and they get to talk it out. And the thing with this is that the person who did the crime or did the incidents really get to see the impact that their actions has had on that person. And the goal behind it is hopefully, it enforces that empathy. And when they can see what the impact that their actions have, so that they can have a little bit of empathy so that they can change their behavior. So the ideal behind that also is that it helps to restore and rebuild a relationship, especially if that incident is between the teacher and student. It gives them the opportunity to talk it out. It gives the student an opportunity to be heard. It gives the teacher an opportunity to explain why the actions impacted them. And then hopefully it helps them to form a better relationship as well. And here are just a host of other alternatives in terms of reactive approaches as opposed to exclusionary discipline practices. And I just listed a few of them here. Of course, there are a ton more. These are approaches, interventions, strategies that are research-based, just things like wraparound services, truancy reduction. There's some de-escalation strategies in here, some great classroom management strategies. Character education, we know building those character education skills is part of that social emotional learning. But these are some great alternatives and some links that lead you to more information about them, but just things that we can use in lieu of putting the kids out of school, things that we can use that really help focus on the behavior, the function of the behavior, and let's try to figure out how we can change that behavior, because we know the research is showing us that just putting a kid out of school is just simply not working. The exclusionary practices that we have been using are not working for us, and they're not working for our students. So now what? What do we do from here? Where do we go from here? Well, again, it comes back to ensuring that we keep them so that we can teach them. What can we do to have the most immediate impact? Well, the biggest thing is we have to work to eliminate the disparities. Ultimately, we have the power, we have the skills, we have the knowledge to keep students in the classroom. As educators, we create those positive environments where students can thrive. We have to consider non-exclusionary approaches to discipline. We have to eliminate any policies that do more harm than good. We have to eliminate disparities. We have to make sure that we are recruiting a diverse teacher population. Again, representation does matter. So we want to make sure we eliminate some of those disparities by really making sure that we're putting teachers in front of our kids that look like them, that resemble them, or that the teachers that are in front of our kids are culturally responsive. Also, we have to create a supportive environment for our students. We want to make sure that we provide the needed and ongoing professional development and training for our teachers so that they can minimize some of these behaviors in the classroom, because it really does start at that classroom level. At a minimum, such training and professional development should include communication skills, peer-to-peer strategies, developing cultural competence, awareness of one's own implicit biasness, developing understanding culturally competent pedagogy, and also, again, becoming more culturally responsive to one's own approach in education and discipline. And again, it really is an awareness. Is teachers actively taking a look at themselves and making themselves aware of their own actions, their own implicit biases, and how all of these things have an impact on the decisions they make in terms of how we discipline kids. So in conclusion, keep them, teach them. And I'm from the South, so, I tend to cut off my words, and I said, keep them, teach them. That went faster than expected. Questions, comments, concerns?
Dr. Jones, phenomenal content, so much stuff for us to think about and ponder over. I think I prefer keep them so you can teach them. But then again, we're South Carolinians, right?
Right.
So that's where it comes from. So we'll give folks a few minutes to plug in any last questions. Just want to let everybody know that we'll make sure to share on our website as well as on our social media the incredible wealth of resources that Dr. Jones embedded within her PowerPoint today. I've plugged in some additional resources that Dr. Jones shared prior to her presentation into the chat. We'll also make sure to link that. So don't fear, we'll make sure that you have access to everything that has been discussed today. And you'll be able to find that at www.schoolbehavioralhealth.org/BASK. So we're getting some feedback here that folks really love to keep them so you can teach them. We've got a great presentation. It really was. We had folks coming in joining us from Metro Atlanta today, which is really exciting. We see Jennifer says, wonderful information, such an important topic. Thank you so much, Shannon.
Thank you.
Let's see here. We've got one in the Q&A. Let's see what this is. Okay. So Dr. Jones, we've got a participant that's asking, do you have ideas on how to engage parents who may have had their own trauma and negative experiences when they were in school? That's a phenomenal question.
How to engage them in terms of getting them to come into schools? And I really think that it is up to the schools to make sure that they are looking for those opportunities for that parent engagement. It's up to schools to make sure that they are having those, not just the open schools, but different, well, now, I mean, we don't know what that looks like in this environment, but once schools open up, I think that schools also have to have, how we have those different parent universities and those different things that are specifically targeted for parents. I think that some schools do have to take in consideration that the reason why students have behavior issues, problems, issues, trauma, it comes from their environment. So we do have to make sure that we have some targeted assistance, some interventions where we are directly targeting them for parents. So I think maybe schools having, again, some of those interventions, some of those things that aren't just open for students, but are open for parents. And just making sure that those opportunities get out there. Because again, until you get to the root of the problem, and that root of the problem is that parent, until you deal with it at that parent level, then it's very hard to deal with it at the student level.
Awesome. Allows us to figure out ways
Well, I
to.
just wanted to see if anybody had any ideas for what their schools are doing to promote getting those parents in. And I don't know if it's open forum or if anybody could talk or how it is. But.
Oh, if we've got anybody joining us from the phone, you can unmute yourself by pressing *67. If not, you can respond to Dr. Jones's question in the chat, where she's asking if you all have any ideas about how to engage parents. Yeah.
Is anybody doing anything amazing or just different in terms of parent engagement?
I think folks may be ready to engage in some turkey and go ahead.
Yes, I agree.
Okay, so Atlanta chimed in. Jabari Cobb says, first, redefine parent engagement. That's interesting.
I would love for him to elaborate.
Virtual interaction is now the norm.
It is. It really is. And I think the virtual interaction actually opens up and gives us more opportunities to have some of that parent engagement, because before it may be difficult for a parent to come in and be at something at 6 when I just got off work at 5 or 5:30. But because I'm going right home and now that it's virtual, I think that's a good point. And thanks for pointing it out, because now I have more opportunities. Now you can be cooking dinner and getting kids ready and still enjoying or joining in some of those virtual activities. So I think the virtual world has actually opened up a little bit more opportunities for us. And it's good that you say that.
Hello, in the past, we've had lunch and learn events and parenting workshops. That's from Brianna McNeil. Hi, Brianna.
Sounds good. Yeah, I think we're gonna have to be creative, at least for the next year until we get back to normal, hoping that we get back to normal. But I think, again, the virtual world brings us a opportunity to be innovative and creative in terms of that parent engagement, as well as the student engagement.
I love looking at that silver lining and figuring out how we can use these tools that are at our disposal to create opportunity. Even though I know that sometimes technology can play against us.
Exactly. And you got to think about, technology with the parents as well, and them being able to use the technology, but it's an opportunity to learn as well.
And you get welcome into each other's homes. I think that's quite lovely and really unique in the virtual setting, is you're literally in someone's home with them. Well, we are about 2 minutes out before 5 o'clock. I'm going to double check and see if we've got any last questions. So we do have one more piece of feedback here. Let's see, I have found that virtual engagement has really helped with parents being available to dialogue about their children's academics and making sure their child is completing work. There's a lot more parent monitoring of work completion and submission.
I would have to agree. And I think it's kind of, when the kids are at school, it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. But when they're in school, right in your living room, or right at your kitchen table, then it kind of forces you to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do in terms of, being involved and make sure the work is done, because now that a bulk of that falls back on you. So it really has taken a lot of the burden off the teachers and put it back on the parents. I know for me as a parent, and I am a teacher, the virtual learning was very hard for me. It's almost like I had to, get back in the groove of being able to teach and being able to help my child to that extent. So I would say that while this has been very inconvenient, it definitely has had a lot of good things to come out of it, such as parents being more involved with their child's learning.
Absolutely. Well, folks, we want to say a massive, massive thank you to Dr. Jones for sharing your time and expertise with us and with the community today, and all of the effort that went into this incredible presentation. BASC is very grateful to have you on our team and supporting the work that we do in the state of South Carolina. Is very lucky to have you advocating for our children and our teachers and our systems of care. So for everyone that took time out of your day today, thank you so very much for joining us. Again, please check out our website and our social media. Follow us at BASC on Facebook.com. We have a whole channel on YouTube. All of that is accessible through our website at www.schoolbehavioralhealth.org/BASC. Also, we are deep in the weeds planning our 2021 conference. It'll be a hybrid conference. Registration will be live soon, so y'all can look out for that. It's the largest school behavioral health conference in the Southeast. We'd love to have you attend either in person or virtually. And please check out all of our resources, including this phenomenal presentation. So thank you so very much, Shannon. And thank you again to everyone who joined today. Y'all have a fabulous holiday, and we look forward to seeing you next month for our next webinar.
Have a safe and happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Bye, folks.